Funding for this program provided in part by the Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission.
Hello, I'm Tommy Sanders here at the Old State House Museum in downtown Little Rock to help mark a significant event in our nation's history and our state's history. As we go about our modern lives distracted by technology, media, politics, it's important for us as a nation to remember our past. 2011 marks the sesquicentennial anniversary of the American Civil War. 150 years ago, in May of 1861, Arkansas seceded from the Union as a divided state and joined the rest of the country in a conflict that would eventually claim the lives of over 600,000 Americans, including more than 9,000 Arkansans. In the next hour, we'll talk to historians, experts, and educators who will shed light on this important period in Arkansas history and explain its relevance, what we can learn from it, and how the effects of the Civil War are still felt today. Stay with us for an hour of history and insight as we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Civil War in Arkansas. Welcome back to CW 150, Remembering the Civil War in Arkansas. I'm here in the House of Representatives chamber at the Old State House Museum in Little Rock, which is the very place where it was decided that Arkansas would secede from the Union. With me is Dr. Tom DeBlack, a professor of history at Arkansas Tech University who specializes in Arkansas history, including the Civil War and Reconstruction. Welcome, Dr. DeBlack.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time tonight. Why don't we just set the stage, and why don't you tell us about the forces that led this country to civil war? What was working? What was clashing in this country?
Well, the primary issue was slavery, particularly the issue of the expansion of slavery into the new territories. And with the election of a Republican president in 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, whose party was opposed to any further extension of slavery, 7 southern states decided that they would leave the Union. Arkansas was not among that first group to secede, but secession begins with South Carolina shortly after Lincoln's election.
So was there a decision, a vote taken in this assembly right here that was anti-secession the first time around?
There was a convention to consider the issue. That convention had a Unionist majority, and despite repeated appeals from high-ranking officials inside and outside Arkansas, it steadfastly refused to take Arkansas out of the Union.
And then what happened?
And then Fort Sumter happened, and President Lincoln requested all states to supply a certain number of troops to help suppress the rebellion, and this forced Arkansas to make a decision, either to fight with the Confederacy or to stay in the Union and fight against the Confederacy.
So you would say that public sentiment turned around at that point within the general populace of the state, or just among the people who were the big-time decision makers here?
Probably both. I think you could have called most Arkansans conditional Unionists, that they, while they were not ready to secede in the first convention, they thought those states that had seceded had the right to do so and would have opposed any attempt to coerce them back in.
Most Arkansans were not slaveholders, were they?
That's correct. Only a minority of Arkansans held slaves.
Okay. Secession is a pretty serious thing, and a lot of Arkansans probably didn't want to lose that federal government, the things they got, especially I'm thinking of the people in western Arkansas who wanted protection from whatever wild was going on across the border over there.
Now, there were several reasons why Arkansans would want to stay in the Union, and you talked about one. And plus the fact Arkansas had only been in the Union since 1836, and it had a lot to gain from staying in the Union. So it's not an easy decision. It is a huge decision they make to leave the Union.
Compared to the surrounding states, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, was Arkansas not as enthusiastic about the whole secession
those
question?
States that you mentioned went with the first group. Yeah. Between Lincoln's election and Sumter, Arkansas does not go until after Sumter.
So what was the effect of this decision to join the Confederacy, to engage in secession, mean to the average Arkansan? And who was the average Arkansan at that time?
Well, that's hard.
Can you draw us a profile of someone?
Yeah, I don't know that there was an average Arkansan then any more than there is now. You had very wealthy slaveowners, particularly over in the Delta. You had subsistence farmers. Arkansas is still pretty much in a frontier state at this time. But the Civil War is going to have tremendous implications for thousands of Arkansans. Hardships that would have been unimaginable when they took the decision to secede in 1861.
Can we know, say, if you took 100 Arkansas people, how many of them would have, Arkansas males, how many of them would have gone to fight? Do you have any idea?
It's hard to say. It is hard to say. We do know there is quite an enthusiasm for secession in certain parts of the state, much less so in other parts of the state. And of course, eventually, a lot of Arkansans will fight in the Union Army as well. Arkansas is going to send more troops to the Union Army than any other Confederate state except Tennessee.
More than any other state?
Confederate state except Tennessee.
So Arkansans fighting against Arkansans in effect. What was the first Civil War battle fought in Arkansas?
Well, the first major battle was at Pea Ridge up in northwest Arkansas, when a Federal Army coming out of Missouri is attacked by a Confederate Army under Earl Van Dorn in March of 1862. And in this two-day battle, the Federals were able to resist that attack and eventually win the battle. That battle in March and the Battle of Prairie Grove in December of that same year helped secure Missouri for the Union, but they did not guarantee federal control of Arkansas. That's going to take a lot more fighting to do.
How strategic was Arkansas, or which part of Arkansas seemed to be the most strategic, the most prized by the commanders of the different armies there?
Well, I think it's pretty clear, I think, that Arkansas was the key to Missouri. Missouri, of course, is a slave state that has not seceded, and many of the officers who served in the Confederacy in Arkansas were Missourians. And we really wanted to see Missouri added to the Confederacy and spend a lot of time and effort and men and material in trying to get that done. Of course, it never happens. But there is a sense that develops in Arkansas rather quickly that Arkansas is not held in high esteem by decision makers in Richmond, at high levels of the Confederate government, and among some that it is a little more than a dumping ground for generals who can't cut it in the East. They get sent here.
So what did that mean for Arkansas, to be looked upon as sort of askance like that?
Well, there are some Arkansans who are so unhappy with these decisions, they threaten to secede from the Confederacy. But of course, they don't do that. But Arkansas is going to be a very difficult state for both sides to control. You do have serious disagreements here. Arkansans had many different political persuasions, and that's going to make the fighting here particularly bitter.
5 long, hard years of war, lots of damage, lots of death and destruction. How did Arkansas, at least compared to these states we talked about earlier surrounding Arkansas, emerge from this war? What kind of shape were we in when the war was done?
The war is devastating for Arkansas in a lot of ways. Economic losses, destruction and devastation, significant loss of population, both black and white. This is offset, of course, to some extent by the fact that slavery has ended, and over 100,000 Arkansans who had been slaves before the war are going to become free people as a result of this war. But the Civil War is in many ways a disaster from which Arkansas takes a long time to recover, if it ever has in fact recovered at all.
Now, expand on that. I mean, what burdens do we still bear from the Civil War in this state of Arkansas?
Well, in the 1850s, Arkansas was ranked 16th of the 33 states in the nation in terms of wealth per capita. Of course, we've never reached anything approaching that status again comparatively to the other states. So it is a devastating thing for the future, not only in terms of property loss, but in terms of the lives of thousands of Arkansans that are ended forever, or that are killed or who don't choose to come back to the state, and thousands of other civilians, women and children, who were left alone when the men went off to fight and suffered incredible hardships.
Disease and starvation.
Disease, starvation, threatened continually by ravaging armies or bands of irregulars or just outright bandits. And all of this contributes to a tremendous hardship for Arkansans of many different political persuasions and both races.
All right, Dr. Tom Black, thank you so very much. We appreciate your time there.
Thank you.
The history of the Civil War is fascinating, but sometimes it's a challenge to connect the past to the present. To help better understand the relevance of the Civil War for us today, we went out and asked the question, why commemorate the Civil War?
I think it made all of us see Americans as being one people as opposed to many people. And even though it was very divisive, of course, during the war, the post-war reality was we could look back and at different times back at that war and say, well, it was about Americans working out some, internal issues that ultimately lead us to greatness.
It was a trial by fire. Our country went through an ordeal to see if indeed we could stay the course as a union. Today, we think of ourselves as the United States. And that was very foreign to the people living during that 150-year-ago conflict. In many cases where people in a given state, they had so little knowledge of what went on in other states, it might as well be another country.
The notion of becoming one people as opposed to many people. I just don't think that we would be the same country if we had not gone through this great tumult. Who has the final authority? Are we Americans, or are we really citizens of separate states who just come together in a confederation whenever we think it fits our mutual interests?
We talk about the World War II generation, a great generation. I think our Civil War generation was one of those key generations that did a tremendous amount of sacrifice. They went through something that we can only just barely dream of, and they were able to survive it for the most part. More importantly, our society, with some help here and there through Reconstruction, it wasn't overnight, but it's something that our country grew together in the aftermath of.
Well, we've made great strides, I think. There's been enormous change, and I'm old enough to remember some of that change. We still struggle with these problems. Many people in the Black community are still disadvantaged because of this heritage. It's interesting when you look at Reconstruction, a lot of blacks coming out of slavery did very, very well. And there was about a 20 or 30 year sort of window of change there, and then Jim Crow stepped in. And then we went into a darker racial era, and then began to emerge from that with the Civil Rights Movement in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on.
The end result of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment in particular, is that we did, in terms of civil rights and due process and civil liberties eventually, we did what many people had argued we should have done in the late 1700s, which was we nationalized citizenship. Now, of course, it took another 100 years for the U.S. Supreme Court to insist on applying each of those protections, right, to the states at a minimum, to apply that minimum national standard. But at least it set us down the right road toward a nationalization of what it means to be a citizen.
You do sense that when you're looking at the run-up to the Civil War, there was just, it seems to me, an atmosphere of national hysteria. You can sense some of that in the time that we live in the polarized political and cultural warfare that goes on now. I suppose it has always gone on in some respects in many societies.
No matter how many different segments of society we have, no matter how our demographics change in America, and they will, they're changing every day, we need to always hold true to that idea of unity, the fact that we are a united people. And if we stay united, we can persevere, we can go through just about anything that the world throws at us. But when we start getting to the point where we cannot agree and the system breaks down, then you're prone to have a repeat of what happened here short 150 years ago.
We still need to do more to understand this event in our state's history. And I think it will only benefit us.
I think that we think too little about the Civil War as a society. But when we can connect with those things, I do think it helps us in so many contemporary ways. You know, some of the rankle that we have in Congress and you know, the parties and what have you, when we can see the things that connect us, that make us who we are fundamentally as a people, I think it helps us to be able to deal with these issues in a more effective way.
Well, I'm certainly someone who thinks that much good can come of remembering and investigating and researching.
An understanding of the Civil War and its importance to shaping American life will lead naturally to a more critical assessment of contemporary issues.
There's tremendous complexity to Arkansas's experience with the Civil War, and it's not that there's not complexity for the South in general, but it's a rich history. It's a complicated history. It's a history that doesn't fit neatly into late night talk show punchlines. Really doesn't even fit neatly into a chapter of a book. So I think a 4-year-long enterprise in grappling with that history is something that's merited and should be richly rewarding for all of us.
Well, joining us now to help further explain how the Civil War impacts contemporary American culture is Sharice Jones-Branch, Associate Professor of History and Assistant Department Chair at Arkansas State University. Dr. Jones-Branch, thank you very much for making some time for us tonight here.
Thank you for having me.
150 years afterward, and we, as we say, are commemorating the start of the Civil War, but the Civil War is something you've been dealing with for several days out of the course of a year in your classes at Arkansas State University. What do students seek to know? And that may be at odds with what you seek to tell them, but what are they curious about when they come in and start studying the Civil War?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that they are curious. They come to the class with their own ideas about what happened during the Civil War, and I spent a lot of time debunking myths about what happened during the Civil War. Oftentimes for students, it's a matter of the federal government fighting the southern states, and it was a matter of federal rights versus states' rights, and southern whites preserving their way of life, and that's certainly true, but what I try to get them to understand was that the Civil War was far more nuanced than that, and there were far more people involved than just northern whites fighting southern whites.
So what's the thing that surprises them the most? What's the thing that floors them, the thing that they've misunderstood the most through the years?
I think the thing that they misunderstand the most are the roles of African Americans, the roles of women, the roles of other people who are neither black nor white who participated in the Civil War. And the fact that while there were 600,000 plus Southern lives lost, a lot of African Americans died in the war, and a lot of women were involved in the war and wanted to make sure their husbands were okay. Again, the idea that the Civil War is far more nuanced than what you would get in, say, Gone with the Wind or the movie North and South.
Sure. What do most people who haven't had a course in African American studies or studied the Civil War, what did they think that happened to most slaves, African American slaves in this country during the course, those 5 years of the war?
Well, I guess they just thought they were just sitting on the plantation, right? But again,
sort of waiting it out.
Just sort of waiting out the war, exactly. But again, far more nuanced than that. I tell them that while the war liberates African Americans, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't liberate all African Americans. It depends on where you live. And also the fact that, again, they weren't sitting around waiting to be emancipated. Some of these people had been liberating themselves all along. And among those people who liberated themselves, some of them fought in the Civil War.
Yes, many of them joined the Union Army, came back to Arkansas to fight against the Confederates here in Arkansas.
Absolutely.
Right?
And that African Americans in Arkansas, for example, and I'm not an Arkansas historian, but from what I understand, there were African Americans involved in 29 of the skirmishes that occurred in the state of Arkansas. And these are the kind of things that they are just absolutely unaware of. They know about some of the battles, but they don't know who fought in many of these battles, and they don't understand that many of these soldiers were African American.
Were these all black regiments, or were they integrated groups of soldiers? How did that work back in those days for the Union Army?
Again, my knowledge on that particular topic is limited, but my understanding is that there were at least several all black regiments, even in the state of Arkansas, and that several thousand African Americans served in those regiments.
When we look at the broader picture of the Civil War and what's happened since then, and you take the viewpoint of African Americans, Native Americans, Americans of European descent, do they all see it differently? Do they all see it as a different kind of struggle?
I really can't speak to the experience of Native Americans. I can speak more to the experience of African Americans in that, again, the war was a war for emancipation, and they increasingly understood it that way. I think the way it's been taught and the way a lot of people understand it is that it's federal rights versus states' rights. But if you are an African American and you've been enslaved, and of course there were African Americans who were free and who had always been free,
sure.
They understand this as the potential liberation of approximately 4 million people of African descent in this country. I mean, I think they understood even before the war became about slavery that in the end this was going to mean their liberation.
I asked you before we taped here in your your course of African American Studies is a two-parter, and the Civil War gets you about through the first part.
Yes.
When you concentrate on the effects of the Civil War and how they shape the lives of African Americans and society as a whole, what are the things you try to get across? What are the things that you think students need to study, and what do they need to take with them when they leave your classroom?
What they need to take with them, and what I really emphasize, is that while African Americans, some African Americans are liberated, what does it mean to be free? I mean, I think people are under the impression that, well, you know, these people are free now and they can start living life in this way and fully embracing what it means to be a U.S. citizen. Well, that didn't really happen in quite that way. It happened for some people, but a lot of people fail to realize that immediately after the Civil War, life became a lot more restrictive for very many African Americans. And of course, you know, I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but you know, the Jim Crow laws are passed, and life becomes very difficult for a great many African Americans. So the question I always leave them with is, how free is free? How free is free?
When you think about that question and the progress that hopefully is being made with each successive generation, I mean, how far have we got to go before all the age-old resentments and grievances and so forth or will they ever be dissolved or forgotten?
Well, I prefer to be optimistic. I want to believe that at some point, probably not during our lifetime, that will happen. But I think there's plenty of evidence that we've made tremendous strides in that direction. So I think it'll happen one day. I'm not sure that it'll be soon, because we're talking about overcoming a few hundred years of racial prejudice and racial oppression, and that's just not a change that's going to happen overnight or in a couple of years or in a generation or even 2 or 3 generations. That kind of work takes time. Your
students leave interested in the Civil War? Are they you know, spurred to go further in their studies?
I hope so, because I give them an awful lot of information and I explain things to them that would have probably never occurred to them before, and things that I'm certain that they didn't get in their high school courses. So I hope I whet their appetites a little bit, and that they do want to read more and know more about the Civil War experience. But they certainly get a lot of information while they're in the class.
Dr. Sharice Jones-Branch, thank you so much. Coming up next, a living historian by the name of Josh Williams. We'll be right back. Welcome back. With me now is Josh Williams, the curator for historic Washington State Park in Washington, Arkansas. Mr. Williams is involved in the living history of the Civil War and has been a reenactor for over 15 years. You're not just involved, you are living history. Look at you right here. I'm not going to sit here and talk to you for 5 minutes without asking you tell us about the clothes you have on there.
Well, specifically, the uniform that I have on was the uniform that was worn by the first unit that left Hempstead County.
Which is where Old Washington is.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Washington was the county seat of Hempstead County.
Okay.
It's one of the original 5 counties of the state of Arkansas. But this was the first unit is called the Hempstead Rifles.
The HR there, and that's a reproduction of an actual?
That is correct. It was based off a photograph a man by the name of Joseph Stewart. It was on his wedding day, and he has this particular badge right there and belt in the photograph.
Did he
Along with
survive
the
the
Bowie
war,
knife,
as far as
too.
you know? Did Joseph Stewart?
Yes, sir.
He did. He
He
did.
did.
And the Bowie knife as well.
Along with the Bowie knife, of course, that's always been a debated topic, but is home of one of our famous blacksmiths, James Black,
Right.
Who has been said to have made a knife for Jim Bowie. And one of the famous ones is one that's labeled Bowie number 1, that's been attributed to him. And it's a coffin handle, which is like how this one is made, with a type of coffin handle like that.
That's pretty fancy right there. Now, that's a...
But some of the different documentation points out that some of the different units that went to the first battle of Wilson's Creek at the beginning of the war that came from Arkansas were carrying blades from 25 inches up to 32 inches long.
Holy cow. I mean, they could clear brush with that kind of stuff.
Yes.
I mean, that's a
Very much
serious,
so.
serious knife right there. Now, what is that's not a color that most people would associate with the blue and gray sort of
That is
Civil
correct.
War notions.
And that's probably the most significant thing to remember, particularly at the beginning of the war. There was no standard uniform, per se, outside of the Federal Army. Everyone had their own colors, in a sense. And they were all state militia, as they were, and they all volunteered for a brief period of time, and each of them had their home colors, kind of like a baseball team.
What are those colors called? What would you call those?
These are basically like a type of, it's dyed gray that turns brown butternut color.
Butternut is what that's called.
Yes, and then with a red trim. That was very common with a lot of shirts that were done that time. They would have a type of trim that would go along
With
it.
the billed hat and so forth.
Yes,
like that.
that's a common persons had during that period of time in the mid-19th century that was worn. And then, of course, you have white belts and so forth. That was common military-wise, particularly cadets wore that in their dress uniform. So white leather was very common for the leather part. And then you have your basic other accoutrements, like with your mug, your haversack where you keep most of your different items, like, plate, fork, knife, those type of things. And canteen, of course. And then your musket.
Yeah, your musket. And you get to dress up in this, not just to be on television, but you do something. We'll get to that in just a minute, but I want to talk about Old Washington State Park for just a minute. Old Washington was significantly larger back then than it is now.
Correct.
And one of the reasons was it was at one time the Confederate capital of Arkansas, right?
That's correct. During the middle of the war, when Little Rock fell in September of 1863, the Confederate government of Arkansas moved down the military road to Washington, Arkansas, and that's where they set up the state government during that time till the end of the war in May of 1865. Also, the Missouri Confederate government was stationed in Washington for a brief period of time as well.
Now, was it known as Arkansas? Was it just known as Confederate Arkansas? What was the entity known as by this government that was set up?
Confederate Arkansas.
Confederate Arkansas.
Yes.
And there was a governor?
Yes, Governor Harris Flanagan was down there, and they called a legislative meeting in 1864, and they met there in the building that still stands today. It was the courthouse of Hempstead County, built in 1836. And
Still there?
Yeah,
Original
it still
building.
stands there today. We still provide tours to that building.
Updated a little, or preserved a little
Preserved.
bit.
I mean, it's was restored back to its 1836 appearance. And
Fascinating.
again, where they met, as well as the state Supreme Court.
How big a town is Washington today?
Today, we have a population of 150.
150.
Yes. Now, during about the time of the Civil War, it was probably its peak. It was reflecting the growth that was going around the state of Arkansas at that time. But a total of around 1,000 people claimed Washington as their hometown.
So a much bigger place, cotton gins and stuff like that.
Exactly, merchants and so forth, getting things from New Orleans. And for an agrarian society, 1,000 population of a town is a good size.
Pretty good sized town. Okay, back to when you put on those clothes. You are a Civil War reenactor, which we've all heard of these gatherings of people. What are they all about in a nutshell? I mean, what brings these people together? What excites them?
Interest, particularly in the period, particularly in the Civil War, is still probably the most popular, researched, and talked about event in American history of that. But part of it is the interest there, and learning more about it, the details, and sharing that love and interest to other people. About, learning about, like, okay, what does it mean to march in a line? I mean, you can read about it and so forth, about these different battles that went on in the Civil War, but what does that really mean? And you can't really know that until you actually maybe act it out and put it into perspective that way. and you get an idea then like what these men are going through in some perspective. Now, you can't do it 100% accurately, of course.
Sure.
Because we didn't live then. But try to get some glimpse of it to share with the modern public.
Now, are you reenacting actual battles that
Yes.
you've studied and
That's correct.
and try to,
Yes.
and in some cases on the actual ground where they were fought?
That's correct.
Yeah.
One that they do is Prairie Grove here in the state of Arkansas. It's up in northwest Arkansas and happened in 1862, December of 1862. And they commemorate and do a battle reenactment every other year up there on the actual ground that battle took place.
What's been your favorite battle to recreate?
Probably, it was in 1998, I went to the 135th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Wow.
And that was probably my most exciting one because you have people come from all over the world, which just says right there the impact of the American Civil War, not just in the United States, but to the rest of the world, how much people are interested in this period of history.
I know you're all concerned about authenticity, but I would imagine the participants in these reenactments are a lot healthier looking than the fellows who actually fought the Civil War back then.
Yes, yes. They definitely are more well-fed and so forth than the ones that actually went through the experience themselves.
Fascinating. Josh Williams, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We do appreciate it. Well, coming up, I'm going to be joined by Richard Davies, Executive Director of the Arkansas Department of Parks and Tourism. But first, let's take a look at some more reenactors at Reed's Bridge in Jacksonville.
My name's Steve Shore, and today we're having a recreation of the Battle of 1863, August 27th, when the Union was pushed back from the Battle of Reed's Bridge.
But the most important thing is we actually, this is an overused phrase, but we bring history to life. We did a program one time for our 6th grade group, and the gentleman stood up and he said, for years and years and years, I've read about history. But today, I learned about history because he put on the uniform, he used the rifle. We do that with the girls, we put them in the clothing. Until you've been in a corset and a big hoop dress, you have no idea what the ladies lived through until you do it yourself. So the educational value is critical for me. Everyone likes to have hobbies, and this is an interesting hobby. The history part of it is very important, and we all try to be authentic.
To read about the Civil War, you don't get the full hands-on effect as if you would being a reenactor. Last night we showed up at 9:30 and pitched a tent in the dark, and I slept on the ground. And you don't get that from reading a book. It was hard just to live here back then, let alone being involved in a war that, regardless if you wanted it or not, it was going to end up in your front yard anyway. I've been doing reenactment for about 3 years now. I do the Civil War reenactment just for the simple fact that it's educational. The kids love it. You know, if you can make a kid, you know, understand more about history, then you're doing good.
Battle reenactments are popular events around Arkansas, and while Reed's Bridge is a city park in Jacksonville, many of these events happen in and around Arkansas state parks. With me now to explain more about the resources available around the state, Richard Davies, the Executive Director of the Arkansas Department of Parks and Tourism. Have you ever done a reenactment, Richard?
I've never done one. I've been to several, and
yeah.
I actually like going around the campgrounds at night because it makes you feel like you're in the wrong century. I mean, it's very eerie, and I'm always impressed with the research that the reenactors do on everything from their buttons to their bayonets.
Very meticulous. Places of historical significance, a big part of your overall view there.
Mm-hmm.
The Department of Parks and Tourism, the Civil War, plays pretty prominently, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we've got Pea Ridge National Park up in northwest Arkansas, which nationally is one of the best preserved battlefields in the country. What happens in a lot of areas, lots of places, is, you know, what might have been fields in 1860 something are now woods,
sure,
and that sort of thing. Well, Pea Ridge is pretty much like Pea Ridge was. Prairie Grove Battlefield, which is a state park right down the road, both battles in 1862, is also very well preserved. We have other smaller battlefields in southwest Arkansas from the Red River Campaign, Marks Mill, Jenkins Ferry, and Poison Spring. And then, you know, museums all over the state. We have a lot to go see.
Yeah. To go back to Pea Ridge, you talked about
Right.
how the landscape has actually been transformed, and it's a wonderful drive. Even it's got some of the old buildings, the houses, the taverns, at least restored versions of those. It's a huge park, and it takes a while to drive through.
And I went on a guided tour, which I would recommend to people.
Oh, it's
with one of the park
beautiful
interpreters
place.
who took you to every stop and explained who was doing what and where they were. And it was really the best explanation I've ever heard of the battle. You know, by the time you get all the way through it about what happened.
Yeah. Prairie Grove, you were telling me about before we taped this program. That was a pretty horrible 2 days.
It was
very,
a tough,
very bloody situation there in
tough
northwest
fight.
Arkansas. Yeah.
For the forces engaged, it was as bad as probably any battle in the war. And it was a draw, but the Confederates had run out of ammo and had to withdraw, so it was really sort of a Union victory. And it is still very much like it was with the old, not a bluff really, but sort of a hillside and the fields out in front, and there are old houses there at Prairie Grove. And
is there interpretive activity? And
oh
all
yes,
that sort of thing?
yes,
you can get the full.
You get the
treatment
full
there.
thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And coming up in 12. I try to say 1862. You know,
yeah, right. The second year of
the second year
yeah.
is going to be the reenactment of the battle on the spot. That will be the 150th anniversary of that battle in first weekend of December. And
first weekend of December, 2012.
2012, and it will be a show.
That'll be a big deal.
Yeah.
This commemoration of the Civil War, 5-year, as the war was a 5-year thing, and it's each year has a theme, correct?
It does. The Civil War sesquicentennial wanted to make, I think, several points, and they wanted it to be statewide as well.
Okay.
And so the first year, 61 or 11, is, you know, the question we've all talked about. Why should we even commemorate the Civil War? Why should kids be interested? Why should we? The next year, 02 or 12, I should say, talks about a divided Arkansas, and we thought we'd concentrate on northwest Arkansas where those battles were, Pea Ridge and Prairie Grove. In 13, we talk about Big War, Little War. There were a lot of people from other states who came to Arkansas, troops from Iowa, troops from Wisconsin, Illinois. As a matter of fact, we have all that on our sesquicentennial website. You can actually go see where every unit that ever was in Arkansas, where they went.
Oh, great.
Oh, it's really cool.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of Arkansans got shipped across the river through Helena to fight in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee. And so that'll be sort of in the Helena area, is we hope to have a commemoration of some kind there. And then in 14, 2 governments. We've talked about Little Rock falling to the Federals, the Confederate government moving to Washington. So we're talking southwest Arkansas, the Red River Campaign again. And then the last year, 15, would be the end of the war,
beginning of Reconstruction.
Exactly.
Yeah, all the aftermath begins right there. You know, you're talking about this Little Rock. This building right here is a very famous photo of it being surrounded by the whole gaggle of Minnesota Union Army regulars.
That's right, federal
right
troops.
There. It's very, very famous. So these sorts of things will be more visible throughout the next 5 years, and everybody in the state will have a better opportunity to see these things.
Yes,
right?
I think so.
And other local effort like Reed's Bridge.
Oh, Reed's Bridge is a great one. Like say the Prairie Grove. I bet you every museum in Arkansas is going. I bet this from the old State House and the other Heritage Department museums will have exhibits. The state parks will. And I think everybody's sort of getting into the whole idea of let's look at this again.
Yeah, and I guess the hope is among your organization and a lot of people in this room tonight that this sort of increased interest is going to bring out some more artifacts and essential information that have been buried below these many years.
I'm convinced there are still things in closets, in trunks, and it's 150 years old at least. Yeah. And so if we don't find it before long, when it is found, it's going to be powder.
Sure.
And so I'm hoping people will find those things, and I'm also hoping that some research, it might interest people to do some research on some things that haven't been covered very well in Arkansas history. Yeah. The war on the rivers, you know, the gunboats. You don't read much about that in Arkansas.
Much about that,
the Unionists in Arkansas, who were these guys? I mean, there were a bunch of them. And you know, where did they go? Where did they come from? What about the blacks in Arkansas? You know, the slaves. What happened to them during the war? There's all kinds of research that probably could be done. There's probably theses that need to be written. And what better opportunity than a sesquicentennial?
This should spur some of that, absolutely. I've been given the term document a day. What is document a day?
The Arkansas Archives, the History Commission, which has more Arkansas documents than anywhere in the world, has put on their website, which is Archives, A-R-K-I-V-E-S, a document from the Civil War every day of the entire 5 years. Something that happened. It might be a letter home, it might be a muster roll from a unit, it might be a letter from the governor to somebody, but every day you can go to Archives and there will be a new document from the Civil War every day for 5 years.
Do you know the address? Can you?
Well,
it's just archives with a K.
ark-ives.com.
All right. I think it's going to be an enlightening 5 years coming up.
It's going to be
Richard.
fun,
It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
Good. I think we'll have good results. Thank you, Richard Davies, so much. We also had a chance to talk with Mark Christ, who is a member of the Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission, who gave us his own recommendations for places and events commemorating the Civil War in Arkansas.
I'm Mark Christ. I'm a member of the Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission. Arkansas has an incredible wealth of sites, battlefields, buildings, museums that collectively tell the story of the state's Civil War history. During the sesquicentennial, you should plan on seeing Arkansas first and see some of these gems that are just waiting to be discovered. We anticipate a lot of activities taking place during the period of the commemoration between 2011 and 2015. One of the big events will be the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Prairie Grove up in Washington County. Prairie Grove has a biannual reenactment that's already one of the biggest in the state. We expect that 2012, the actual sesquicentennial of that battle, is going to be huge. Another exciting thing that's going to be happening will be in Helena. They have a very ambitious plan to better interpret the region's Civil War history that will include reconstruction of Fort Curtis, which was a large earthwork that helped defend the town. That'll make Helena really the premier Civil War attraction between Memphis and Vicksburg.
People really want to visit Helena because we are telling a very authentic story, that we're telling a story of not just the Battle of Helena, but the people that lived in an occupied town, the soldiers, the slaves that came in behind the soldiers. So we're telling a very unique perspective on the Civil War. With the addition of Fort Curtis as well as the other interpretive sites, there's no doubt that someone that comes to Helena would not be disappointed, that there's a lot to see, it's the real story, and it's very exciting.
Any day is a good day to come to Washington, Arkansas, and we're very proud of this historic site that State Parks manages. We interpret everything from 1824, when the town was founded, to its peak, in the 1870s, and its decline by the 1880s. Annually, in the fall, the park puts on the Civil War weekend. Reenactors come and they'll set up camp in town, and then Saturdays and Sundays there's a battle or a skirmish reenactment. During those events, it is especially satisfying to see the public come and attend and able to kind of maybe understand exactly what was going on. Take advantage of these events that will happen throughout the state and learn a little bit of Arkansas history. No better place to do it than historic Washington State Park.
The Commission also has a website, arkansascivilwar150.com, just packed with information. There's a sites page that has information about battlefields, fortifications, buildings, museums that have exhibits based on Civil War Arkansas. We also have an events page, and this is really going to be one of the key components of the website during the sesquicentennial. We will update it regularly as new events are planned. It will have information about what's happening where, when, and who to contact. There's also a page of links. There's links to other states and their commemorative sites, and just a wide variety of places you can go from there. The Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission is very excited about this commemoration, and we look forward to working with the people of Arkansas and our visitors to really make this something to remember for the rest of their lives.
Well, sitting in with us now, Dr. Jamie Brandon with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey at Southern Arkansas University in Magnolia. And Dr. Brandon, not only an archaeologist, but an anthropologist as well. So we have,
That's right.
We have much to talk about.
We do.
And not much time to do it. So when we think about archaeology in the Civil War, I mean, archaeologists are guys we think are out digging in pits with pith helmets on and things like that. But I imagine it's more than that. I mean, especially when you talk about the Civil War.
Oh, yeah. So when most people think about archaeology, they think about something like the pyramids in Egypt. Or if they're Arkansas history buffs, they might think about archaeologists excavating on Native American sites around the state. But Arkansas archaeologists are really interested in the recent past, including the Civil War sites. We're out excavating Civil War period sites all the time.
Actual physical digging.
That's correct. That's correct.
Like, what kind of sites? I mean, where are you working now?
Well, the sort of straightforward answer to that is things like battlefields. When you do archaeology, it's like finding a brand new set of primary documents. And so archaeologists can go to battlefields where history were written by generals who had particular points of view, or, or letters home from troops on the ground that have particular points of view. And we can find out things that aren't in the historical record by carefully documenting and preserving these artifacts in place. So we can follow troop movements around and all different kinds of things. But besides that, archaeologists are also interested in domestic sites. What was life like in the home front? I mean, only 1% of Arkansas Civil War life was spent on a battlefield. There's all different kinds of things. I've been working recently a lot at places like historic Washington State Park to talk about how the town was militarized during the war, what was it like when it became the state capital, for instance.
Yeah. Well, what happened to these little towns and little settlements when the person who was the lead person in making the crop for the family, which was the only way to get food, there weren't grocery stores back then, is taken away? I mean, what happens on these farms? I mean, the women, the children have to step up and do a lot more.
Of course.
Can you see evidence of that?
Of course, you can.
Yeah.
You can see evidence of stress in the household when you're doing archaeology. You can see people making do with the artifacts that we have from the period. And you can see the stress on the household and things like the women stepping up to take roles, which happened a lot during the Civil War.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the anthropological angle of it a little bit. Now, how was Arkansas changed? I mean, what was Arkansas before the Civil War, and what was life like afterwards?
Sure. Well, one of the big things that happened was in terms of identity. I mean, before the war, historians sort of point out that we thought of ourselves as small sections of states, not really as a whole nation. And even though the Civil War kind of momentarily dissolved this idea of American unity, it also, through the process of fighting the war and reconciliation after the war, sort of forged a stronger American identity. Even if you don't buy that argument on the national level, on the state level for Arkansas, it's really true. We were a frontier society, barely getting on our legs when the Civil War knocked those legs out from under us.
So they didn't really think of them so much as being American citizens, just people living out in the territories.
That's right. We were on the frontier out here before the Civil War.
It was a frontier life. And the emancipation of 4 million African-American slaves had a big effect on Arkansas.
Oh, you can't, I don't think there are words to sort of the sort of explain the feelings, I'm sure, that emancipation had for African Americans. They respond to it, we see in the historical record, in a variety of ways. Sometimes they move 3 states away and change their name. Sometimes they stay exactly where they are and do exactly what they were doing in the antebellum period, but for pay, or at least nominally for pay. And I think that has a lot to do with both the joy of becoming, there was overwhelming joy of being emancipated, but there's also a lot of apprehension and fear. How do I actually do this? And there's a lot of individual response. Some people are going to be bolder in their responses, some people more cautious. But nonetheless, at the end of the war, Reconstruction sort of pulled its punch, and we're left with a sort of unfinished emancipation that really it took another 100 years for us to get around the civil rights movement to actually finish some of the work that should have been done in the 1870s.
With regard to technology, I mean, the Civil War was sort of the space program, not in a good way, of that day and age, I mean, a lot was learned in the fields of medicine and communications and things like that,
Sure.
of necessity, because of this giant undertaking. Right?
Sure. I don't know that you can, you know, the Industrial Revolution was underway. I don't know that you can actually take those apart. I mean, the Civil War is kind of part and parcel of a lot of these technologies. There's many, many technologies that were either invented right before the war or were working on during the war.
Telegraphs.
Telegraphs, railroads. Railroads are a great example. Railroads before the war were relatively new. There's about 22,000 tracks in the north, only about 9,000 in the south. The Union used that to great advantage. But following the war, here in Arkansas, it transformed the landscape entirely. I mean, there's 38 miles of tracks before the war. By the end of the 19th century, there's like 4,000. And that changes the geographic and political landscape into what we see today. I mean, towns that were really important antebellum-wise, like Washington, like Lamartine, fall to the wayside, while these new railroad towns like Hope, Waldo, and especially Texarkana sort of come to the fore.
Yeah, you look at a map of Arkansas before the Civil War, you don't even see Texarkana.
No, it doesn't exist. No.
Yeah. Camden's big, and some towns you never heard of before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so modern Arkansas geography really has its roots in these kinds of innovations that come out of the Civil War.
We talk about these 5 years upcoming when we're going to have a higher profile for our awareness of Civil War history in Arkansas. Do you look forward to that? Do you foresee things coming your way, information that's unearthed, so to speak, and
we certainly
expands our knowledge of it?
We would love to visit a lot of these Civil War period related sites, both battlefields and not battlefields, and help. Not very much work has been done in this period in the state of Arkansas, especially when it comes to battlefield-oriented sites. So we would love to come out and meet with landowners and try to understand how preserved some of these sites are and get them in our archaeological site records so we make sure they're preserved for the future.
Quickly, what's the most stunning relic you've ever found regarding the Civil War in all your studies and all your searches?
I get asked these kinds of questions all the time. It's really difficult for an archaeologist to answer. I don't even know where to begin. But it's the personal items. It's items that belongs to an individual that I can know their name, like a slate with a young girl's name on it, or a pocket watch with initials on it, that I can connect to the people. Because in the end, I am an anthropologist, and I want to tell the story of people and their culture, rather than just the artifacts.
Make it come alive. Thank you, Dr. Jamie Brandon. Well, before we wrap things up, let's look again at why it is so important we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Arkansas Civil War.
Because the Civil War was a pivotal point in our nation's history, and certainly in our state's history, too. And we still struggle with some of the problems that were part and parcel of that conflict.
History, it happened, the way it happened, and it's the way we look at it from the lens of our modern society that's important. It's not about the generals. It was those people, the rank and file, that everyday person that was involved, having to live through it, having to try to carry on a household, a farm, with war going on all around you. That had to be just indescribable sacrifice that these people had to endure.
An understanding of the Civil War and its importance to shaping American life will lead naturally to a more critical assessment of contemporary issues.
So there are just all sorts of ramifications for the sesquicentennial and why we should be doing it and why we are doing it.
as one writer said, we went from being separate states to us, America.
Thank you again for joining us as we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Civil War in Arkansas and mark the beginning of 5 years of activities that will mirror the 5-year conflict of the Civil War. Thank you to the Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission and the Department of Arkansas Heritage for their support for this program, and to the Old State House Museum for the use of this amazing historical space. We hope you will take advantage of this anniversary to learn more about our history and more about Arkansas. And to do just that, visit ArkansasCivilWar150.com for a full listing of places and events commemorating the Civil War in Arkansas. I'm Tommy Sanders. Thank you for joining us.
Funding for this program provided in part by the Arkansas Civil War Sesquicentennial Commission.
Arkansas's heritage is natural beauty.
Natural resources.
It's spinning wheels.
And spin doctors.
It's Art Deco and decorative arts.
It's in our hearts.
And hands.
It's rock and roll.
Rocking chairs.
Rock of Ages.
And Rockefeller.
It's all supported by your Department of Arkansas Heritage. Find out what's going on at arkansasheritage.com.
Your heritage is here.